Well, talking about the opportunities and risks of the BRI for the Nigerian economy, well, I'm now being joined by the Director, Center for Infrastructure Policy, Regulations and Advancement at the Lagos Business School, Dr. Bungo Adi. Thank you, Dr. Adi, for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure you listened to that conversation that took place at the just concluded New Economy Forum in China, talking about the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes.
Well, let's just begin by first understanding what the Belt and Road Initiative is all about.
Okay, thank you very much. The Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese government is a kind of a recreation of the Silk Road. If you knew about the Silk Road in the past, in the 19th century. So it's just about a trade route. So in recent times, China has restarted what you call economic corridor. Now, the concept of economic corridor is not a new one in economic development, but it is an integrated infrastructure system that connects diverse cities, trade hubs, manufacturing hubs in different countries over different regions. So what the Belt and Road Initiative is to maintain an economic corridor to grant and maintain and sustain access to key and important trade routes for Chinese inflow of resources, natural resources to China, and then the outflow of produced, manufactured products from China to other countries.
Now, what in your view would you say is the major motivation for the Chinese government to embark on this huge initiative? China is actually proposing to commit about $1 trillion to this project.
Okay, well, let's start from the competitive global economic landscape. Every country like China has been expanding, and I think they've reached a certain level of saturation when it comes to the domestic economy. So the only prospect for growth would be in expanding access to new markets, opening new trading areas and new markets in foreign countries. So it is important for them to maintain that, having access to markets, and not just that, to outcompete others, the Europeans and the Americans as well. So they have to maintain very good relationship with different countries so that they are guaranteed access to those very critical markets, so that production in China could continue as long as they are able to export what they produce. So this is very important for Chinese sustainable long-term growth. And we also understand that China, also population, is quite a very large country. The economy is the second largest in the world, and very soon it's going to be the #1 economy in the world in terms of size. So with that, to maintain this, they require huge, gargantuan inflow of resources, natural resources. And China is also highly productive, with cheap labor. All the manufacturing factories are all relocating to China. So that means that China is just one big production warehouse, production base. So as goods and services and stuff are produced, they have to seek outlets in different countries. So it's important for China to maintain this economic corridor, maintain good relationships so that they can be evacuating their products.
All right. Now, a major component of this BRI is infrastructure investment. We know we have quite a huge infrastructure deficit in Africa, in Nigeria in particular, but just wondering why a lot of people seem to be skeptical about what China intends to do, about what this BRI is all about.
Okay. So, well, what I've said is the positive side of the BRI initiative, the economic corridor. Okay, so that's a positive intent. But of course, it is not difficult to read the geostrategic intent to Chinese investment. So we've seen in recent times, last year, there are some takeovers of core infrastructure assets constructed in some countries with Chinese money. Okay, we can talk about Zambia, the Zambian Kenneth Kaunda International Airport, Zambian energy company, ZESCO, that's falling into Chinese hand because of the failure, the default, the loan default of those countries, because those infrastructures were constructed using Chinese aid. And that is what some American senators sent a report to the Congress last year, and they accused China of what they call debt trap diplomacy or tide aid. Now, these are not new things. Nobody gives you money for nothing. After all, that is also how America got into the Second World War. And then some people will tell you that it is also one of the reasons behind the establishment of the Bretton Woods institutions, such America could rebuild Europe so that they can, get repaid the investment in the Second World War. So China is using the same strategy. So as they expand investment in infrastructure, but you can see that China is only interested in key natural infrastructure assets. So they get access to assets, and then they build infrastructure using their own finance. So people they say, I have actually covered that on my column, and then I said that it's a weaponization of finance. So that is what we've seen China doing in so many countries. Hambantota Airport in Sri Lanka has fallen into their hands. And then, so when you read this geostrategic intent in Chinese, engagement with the rest of the world, you would see that it is quite natural, because when you see commerce, okay, manufacturing, commerce, finance, and the next thing is diplomacy and hard power. So if you have an economic corridor in order to access economic opportunities, routes, maintain economic routes or trade routes, there is need for a hard power to protect that route. So that is what, again, if you, Djibouti, for instance, is an African country of about 1 million people, okay, but Chinese project finance investment in that country has got to about 1.4 billion. Their GDP that's about 75% of their GDP. And then so it's obvious, and China built a military base there. So they are leaving nobody in any doubt regarding their intention in that area, because they've invested heavily. 75% of the infrastructure investment, 75% of the GDP of Djibouti is Chinese investment in that country. So China has interest in defending that. So of course everybody will be worried. And that is what they call debt trap diplomacy.
Well, I think that's the area where Dr. Konjo-Iweala was talking about indebtedness, that
Yes.
African countries have to be very careful in terms of the debts, that they incur through this. But then, if you look at it the other way, some other people would argue, yes, China may have this intent, like you said, but those infrastructure are still within our continent. For instance, in Nigeria, we've had the rail projects, the airport projects, and the likes, power projects, for instance. If this can be done, it is still within the country. So don't you think this is an initiative the government can actually look into, in terms of developing our infrastructure base?
Yeah, it's one opportunity that governments all over the world are exploring, especially when there is scarcity of funds, and then you have the Chinese that are willing to give different concessions, very low interest loans, and sometimes they only want to construct the project using their own funding. But they also have to, give you some conditions that they have to bring the labor. So that, to a certain extent, is not so friendly, to the host countries. But yes, the infrastructures constructed in those countries remain the asset. But if it falls into the hands of China, in the case of loan defaults, it's no longer, the property of those state governments. Like I was
But the
talking about
infrastructure is in Nigeria, for
there,
instance.
yes.
Let's use our country,
So
but then the infrastructure is still there.
it is there. Yeah, that's the advantage. Yes, that we've done that. But again, it opens the way for servitude. So can we will we be able to control the political unrest on the social upheaval that could emanate from such over time? So we've seen so many people expressing fears over Chinese takeover of their economies. I'm not sure that you, as an individual, will be happy that the Chinese are running everything in your state and they don't belong to you. And we also know the rules about capital repatriation, from the Chinese. I'm not sure that when they invest, okay, yes, they provide the services, but you pay for that. So it's not just indebtedness. I think it's also about enslavement.
All right, that brings us to some of the risks that Dr. Konjo-Iweala was trying to talk about. Aside from indebtedness, she did mention right policies. And then talking about right policies, capacity building is also there from what you have said. Now, if, for instance, Nigerian government having signed up to the BRI initiative, how do you think they can actually leverage on this opportunity to build our infrastructure, bearing in mind some of these risks, bearing in mind that they need to get out some right policies and they need to be careful in what they negotiate with, the
Yeah,
Chinese
so,
government?
I think it's about our negotiation power, our bargaining power. Now, let's look at what we have on the table. China needs us as much as we need them. Without access to an economy the size of Nigeria, China wouldn't want to, lose access to the Nigerian market. Now, China also, in fact, the growth in Africa over the past 10, 15 years has been propelled mainly by Chinese economic activities in Africa. There are huge demand for African raw materials. So that's what has propelled much of the growth that has been registered in Africa over the past decade and a half. So meaning that, yes, Africa is as important to China as China is important to Africa, including Nigeria. So when we look at that, so we have to really, come to the table, understanding all our priorities, and then make it clear that this has to be a one-on-one relationship. It's not going to be a sort of an enslavement where we give up everything simply because we have huge need for infrastructure that we don't have money to build. Okay, because we need that. So there are some basic conditions that have to be met. Our government needs to understand, especially the trade negotiators or whoever is involved in the negotiation, need to make it clear that we also have certain rights to be protected, especially the labor rights. So I don't think that it makes sense that the Chinese company is getting a concession here, and then they are bringing all the hands, the laborers, even the manual laborers from China. That has been happening in other countries.
But what about capacity? If you don't have enough capacity
even if we don't have that
do the job.
capacity to do the job, one of the conditions that you give for foreign direct investment is technology transfer. Okay, so we have to make it imperative and incumbent on the Chinese to transfer technology over time. That is the bulk of the local
talking about
content.
technology transfer, do we really have an issue with that?
Of course, we do have an issue with that because technology is contested, is proprietary. Nobody wants to expose their trade rights or trade secrets to anybody. They don't want to share that. And the Chinese are very clever. They would not want you to know the secrets behind their technology. But we have to create incentives that will allow them to train our people so that over time we can also, do some of those things. Otherwise, like I said, it's just kind of an advanced form of enslavement.
So how concessionary are the loans from the Chinese on these projects, that is looking at the interest and, of course, the moratorium?
Yeah, there are three things. China gives they give loans, export credit, and as well as grants. Right? So, how concessionary? I don't think it costs them anything because if you look at it, right now, interest rates all over the world is sub-zero, and China is awash with capital. They are the biggest creditor to the Americans. So that tells you that have the very cheap funds. So that's not an issue. Chinese loans come at come as cheap as you can get them. And their government has committed, I think last year, another $60 billion to Africa over the next 3 or so years. So it's not their money, actually, their funding is quite cheap.
All right. So is there a debt sustainability risk that could arise from taking additional loan facilities from China? We heard Dr. Konjo-Iweala talking about indebtedness of African countries. Of course, our debt to GDP ratio now about 48%.
Yeah,
and saying that's in a dangerous zone.
Yeah, like I said, with due respect to Dr. Konjo-Iweala, I do not I do not trust debt to GDP ratio. It's a statistic that doesn't make a lot of sense because even in China, their debt to GDP is higher than 100%. In the United States, debt to GDP sometimes could be as high as 300%. So that's not a problem that we have. What we have problem is we have a revenue problem, as I keep saying. So do we have enough revenue to enable us or allow us to service those debts? So if we have that, it doesn't matter what amount. And again, how the fungibility of the debts. The debts, the monies that we take, do they translate one-to-one for infrastructure?
Okay. Now, another issue there, which I know she talked about, is the issue of maintenance. What is our maintenance culture, not just in Nigeria, but Africa as a whole?
Again, when we sign concessions, when we give contracts to Chinese, I think the maintenance should be part of the items that we contract. And again, I talked about technology transfer. Maintenance culture is also a technology that could be transferred. So if we build it into the contracting mechanism that we have with the Chinese, so we won't have to worry about that because our people will be trained, to learn the right maintenance culture and implement that. But I think that will be a problem even here because we have a culture of negligence. Largely running, it seems that it runs in the blood here.
So now, if you must advise the federal government on the BRI, what kind of advice would you be offering at this point?
We need the infrastructure deficit is huge. The infrastructure gap is huge. We have gap in funding. We have capacity also gaps. So we need the Chinese as much as they need us. So we cannot be very mendacious, cap in hand, begging the Chinese for all of these things. We also need to know what we bring to the table. So make it incumbent on the Chinese to transfer technology. That is very, very important. And also to protect local jobs.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Adi, for sharing your thoughts on this particular issue. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.